So thanks everyone for joining. This session today is one of our faculty-led workshops with Professor Grant Blume. It's going to be talking about some things that you might be considering as you think about your MPA degree, potentially applying your MPA toward a research career, or thinking about what might a pathway toward a PhD look like for you in the future. So before I turn things over to Grant, I wanted to start our session with an acknowledgement. This is something we do at the beginning of all of our career programs because we want to make sure that we are truly centering the way that we're thinking about this session and the things we're thinking about in terms of long-term goals, plans, careers, as you consider what it means to be a public policy practitioner and the importance of that. It's also not lost on me that this event is taking place during a really tough week right now. As we are seeing intentions about rolling back rights coming down from the Supreme Court. There's an ongoing war happening around the world. And then all of this is happening during a time that is meant to be celebratory. Members of our community are celebrating the end of Ramadan and Eid. And we are coming up on graduation, which is intended to be a very celebratory time for people. And so I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that, as well as acknowledge that we are gathered on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish people and the Coast Salish peoples. This includes lands that touch the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Uquamish, Puyallup, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And as you think about your futures, knowing this history and what it represents, knowing the really difficult circumstances that we are facing in our country and around the world, just know there is a deeply necessary place for policy practitioners, for policy researchers, for people who can be focused on diving into these questions and recommendations about how to move forward policy, make the world a more equitable place, and center the people and communities that are most in need and are being most disenfranchised by existing policies. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you so much to Grant and Hunter, who are going to be leading this session. And I hope that this inspires you to continue with your own personal reflection about what this means for you and your role in working to make the world a better and more equitable place.
Terrific. Thanks, Shannon. Let me just add too that this may be Shannon's last program here at the Evans Schools. So in the spirit of acknowledging impact, Shannon, you have touched the lives of literally hundreds of our students. You've sent them on their way. You've helped them connect to incredible careers. So I've been honored to work with you these past years. We've all been so lucky to have you here and wish you nothing but the best on your next steps. So thank you for everything you've done for us. And putting this together on your last day. What a commitment to the school. So thank you for that, Shannon. I have some slides prepared for you all today. I'd like Hunter to introduce himself and explain why he's here in a moment. But I wanted to say first that this is meant to be conversational, so I'm going to run through some content that we have prepared. We've saved lots of time at the end for questions, but if there's something I can clarify or Hunter can chime in on, please, by all means, ask. And the real motivation of today is to just give you, first of all, the confidence to think about stepping into a research career, because I believe you are absolutely well prepared with your MPA degree to do great research. And it's also to demystify what the PhD is. One of the greatest predictors in the United States of whether or not you earn a PhD is if one of your parents hold a PhD. It's an incredibly esoteric process. I'm only here because I had a friend who was a first generation college student who went through the process herself, who was mentored by someone and helped me demystify the process. So in talking to MPA students over the years, I've been glad to hear when people are interested in pursuing doctoral study. And then also it reminds me that this is a very mysterious process. So some of the information I might share with you today could uh, not necessarily persuade you to get a PhD, and that might actually be a great thing. The completion rates for PhDs in the United States are around 40%, and I think that's in part because as faculty, we don't always do a great job explaining what is this thing and what does it entail. So that's the idea today, is to help you understand the process, maybe help you start to think about if you could imagine yourself pursuing a PhD, and help you think about just more generally what research is. So that's what we're going to do. And before I jump over to share my slides, Hunter, maybe you could share a bit about yourself for folks that don't know you, and you can tell why you're here.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So for those who don't know me, I'm Hunter Smith. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a second-year MPA student here. I am here because I'm starting a PhD in the fall. So Grant invited me to kind of talk about the application process I went through just a few months ago, the decision-making process, and figuring out how I wanted to pursue this for my career. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with all of you. It is definitely a process that needs some demystifying. And to echo Grant's comment, I am only here because Grant demystified the process for me. So very thankful for that. Yeah.
Well, you're a great applicant, Hunter. You would have gotten into programs anyway, but yes, I think I was able to shed some light on these very sometimes medieval seeming processes, and we'll talk about how those work. So let's jump in. And like I said, please ask questions if at any time there's something we can clarify, or if you'd like to wait until the end too, if you have kind of a bigger question. I may have left some things out in what I've got prepared today. So by all means, please let us know what you're thinking about. So let me, do you know what would be, oh, I think I froze up here. I'll give it just a sec.
You are not frozen, but the screen itself has not begun sharing yet.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Great. So can everybody see my screen? Now
Yes.
are we?
Yeah.
Great. Let me say, I earned an MPA here, and I applied to PhD programs in the second year of my MPA program. I did not even really like my quantitative coursework. So if you like quantitative coursework, you're even farther ahead than I was, which hopefully is reassuring. And I took no quantitative electives. I did more education policy and applied to education policy PhD programs, and then applied to the Evans School kind of as an outlier, and ended up here. So I'm grateful to hear that you all have different ideas and different interests, and we can certainly talk a bit about that as we move along here. So let me share with you the 4 questions I think that we might want to think about today. First, this question of what does it mean to have a research career? The second being the different pathways into a research career. And then the third and the fourth questions are more specific to thinking about PhD programs. And I want to note that right off the bat, there's some demystification here, because people apply to PhD programs with only an undergraduate degree. In fact, when I interviewed at the University of Pennsylvania, I was a finalist for their program. I was the only person in a master's program among these 15 people that I met who had applied directly from undergraduate to PhD programs. So right off the bat, I want to assure you that if you've done graduate training here at the Evans School, you've got a skill set that can either lead to applying to a PhD program or pursuing an entry-level researcher position, which I'm going to talk a bit about. So there are different pathways that you can end up in the PhD, and by all means, you could have a great 50-year career in applied research and not earn a PhD. So that's a possibility too. I give you this information just to kind of visualize the fact that there are lots of different pathways that may or may not lead to a PhD based on where you are right now, either in your first or second year of the MPA. So we're going to spend some time talking about this esoteric PhD process, but I wanted to take just a minute first and talk a bit about what it might look like if you decide you want to pursue a researcher position after you finish up your graduate degree at the Evans School. And off the bat, I'll tell you that typically searching for positions like research assistant or research associate or project associate will be places to look. Researcher positions might also be called something like project manager or project associate. So there are lots of different terms that researcher shows up as. I think it's great, though, to have a couple of years of research experience to discern whether or not you want to dedicate 5 or 6 years to earning a PhD. And I'd be happy to share more information if there are questions about this, but I've been a reference for many MPA students that have gotten entry-level researcher jobs at what we might think of as policy research firms. So some of the big ones are Mathematica, Rand, Apt Associates. And again, these students did not take research classes per se at the Evans School. They maybe had some quantitative coursework, but I was able to talk to the fact that these students were great problem solvers, that they were great members of a team. These were students who maybe I had in capstone, and I could talk to how they approached a project in a linear manner to plot out the different steps. That's what these firms are looking for when they hire research assistants and research associates. And I just want to affirm that your coursework at the Evans School qualifies you for these positions. So your quantitative coursework in the core, your analytic coursework and thinking about policy problems, all of that will make you a competitive candidate for these researcher positions. So just for fun, I looked this afternoon at what positions are available to give you kind of a smattering. And Mathematica opened up sometime in the past 5 to 10 years a Seattle office. And so these are 3 positions that Mathematica has open in Seattle right now that are entry level, that you could, with your MPA curriculum and potentially with some professional experience or even a capstone project, you could be a competitive candidate for these jobs: project associate, human services researcher, and then a researcher focused specifically on health policy. So these are in Seattle right now, and it's just a representation of what a really research-focused job might look like for you post-Evans. The other 2 positions, Apt and Associates and MDRC, Apt is based in DC and Maryland. MDRC is in New York. So these obviously would require relocation potentially, but again, I found these positions with just a few minutes of Googling around in terms of what you would be qualified for as an MPA student who's earned their master's degree and ready to work in this applied research field. So for any one of these jobs, you would be potentially doing the things that you all just talked about: analyzing data, potentially conducting interviews or focus groups, thinking about how the different pieces of a project answer questions related to state policy change. So it's very applied work. It can be very rewarding, and it's often project-based. So a lot of these jobs are you working on a portfolio of projects that constantly change. So that's one of the cool things about being a researcher, is you're always doing new projects. You've always got new sorts of things you're implementing. So that's a real quick smattering of what it could mean to, right out of the gate, pursue a research job. And so let me pause there and see if there are any questions before we kind of segue to talking more specifically about PhD programs. Anyone have any questions about that applied? Please, Jose, go ahead.
Yes, Professor. When you say just applying after the MPA, what is your opinion about applying after having some work experience? And actually, you said that like we can like probably go and try a research career even before starting the application for a PhD program. So that's
yeah. I mean, for the students that I've provided recommendations for that have gotten jobs, I can't think of anyone who actually had research experience going into that. They had their capstone, they had their coursework, maybe they had some kind of professional experience, but these organizations that hire researchers oftentimes realize that this is a specialized skill set that they will train you on. So in that way, I think if you get an interview and then through the interview, you're able to demonstrate your skills that, again, will make you a great team member, you're hardworking. I mean, that's what these firms are often looking for when they hire. So I think you could be highly competitive. And I mean, Jose, based on what you said, like, I didn't even get into the environmental research domain, which is enormous in terms of opportunities in Seattle and the Northwest. So again, I think that if you find those opportunities and you tailor your resume and your cover letter to accentuate what research or technical training you've got, then also the fact that you've worked on team projects, that you're able to think big about policy, I think that an Evans student is highly competitive for these kinds of opportunities. Does that answer your question? Great.
Thank you.
Great. So then let's say you are thinking about jobs, but then maybe you're also thinking about the PhD. And this then reflects the fact that you've got a couple different pathways. You could apply, if you're a first-year student, next year you could apply to PhD programs in the second year of the MPA. Or let's say you're graduating in a couple months and you get a researcher position, and then a couple of years into that researcher position, you think, yeah, I want to pursue a PhD to be the person designing the research instead of implementing the research. Because I would say that's one of the key distinctions there is you've got the credential, you're on more of the design side. And if you are with a master's degree, you're more operational and collecting data, although that's not even true because oftentimes with a lot of experience, you do then step into the design side as well. So the PhD gives you lots of training and could be an opportunity. And let's say you want to pursue that and then continue on in a research career. The question is then, of course, what does it mean to earn a PhD? So this is one of the opportunities. I'd like to turn this over to Hunter and just have him share with you a bit about his discernment process that led him to this decision to pursue a PhD. And Hunter, I remember you mentioned this to me way back in the first year in program eval. You said, I'm thinking about a PhD, and that kind of connected us to continue working together. So why don't you take a minute or two and share what that discernment was like for you?
Yeah, sure. So before I go into this, I should note that I came into this program directly out of undergrad. So no break, no work experience in between or anything like that. So my sophomore year of undergrad, I had been talking with one of my professors who was teaching an international law class and told him that I was like vaguely interested in getting some research experience to see if that's something I would be interested in. And he just offered me a position just because I had told him I was interested. So I started doing that. Throughout the rest of undergrad, I had that position and 2 other research positions that really let me, work on some skills, work a lot on literature review and data collection and some basic analysis, things like that. And then by the end of undergrad, I decided that research was something I was interested in, but I wasn't quite ready to do the jump to a PhD yet. I wanted a little more topical knowledge on environmental policy, which is what I'm going to be studying. And I wanted some more analytical methodological training. So that's why I came to Evans to get some of that expertise. I got some more research experience once I got here working with Ann Bostrom. And then here I also got some teaching experience, as a couple of you know, because I was your TA. And that really showed me that I was interested in the teaching side of academia as well. You don't have to do both, but it's likely that you will do both to some extent. So yeah, that's, I think, how I came to realize that this was the route for me. Thinking about a lot of other career opportunities, I get bored fairly easily with a lot of things. And pursuing a research career, an academic career, I think gave me enough of the flexibility to really engage in a bunch of different projects, especially with some of the different methodological training I have. So yeah, I think my experience is a little unique in that I've enjoyed research for a long time, So it just kind of seemed like a natural process for me. And I do want to acknowledge that it will probably not be a natural process for all of you. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of varied pathways to figuring out whether this is the thing for you.
I mean, I think what Hunter acknowledges, which I think is really critical, is he was actually engaged in research to some extent and liked it. And that's where I think if you do have professional experience under your belt for a couple of years with a research firm or working in state, local, or federal government in a researcher role, which there are lots of opportunities out there for that, being able to see like, oh, I like this is important for you. And it's important for the admissions committee to see that you have some firsthand experience. So it's not required. I had no research experience when I applied to the PhD program here, but Hunter's experience and the experience of others who get that applied experience prior to applying, I think can be valuable. So Hunter mentioned a couple of the things I'm going to touch on here. First, I just wanted to define, and this is a relatively dry definition, but PhD is a relatively dry phenomenon, I would say, is this idea that you are someone who's got a skill set, you're taken and trained, and you're trained to be a researcher. And so one of the things that's kind of frustrating and depressing sometimes is people say to me, I've always dreamed of being a professor and I want to get a PhD. And that's a tricky goal to navigate because many of us who earn PhDs aspire to be educators. And also the PhD is deeply grounded in scientific inquiry and research. So if you begin a PhD program with the goal to teach, that can be really challenging because it will be many years of training before you ever step into a classroom to teach. Alternatively, I teach at a local community college, and most of the people who teach at the community college do not have PhDs, and they love being educators. So we could talk about that. I mean, there are ways to teach, and we also hire professors of practice here at the Evans School, so and elsewhere. So as a practitioner, you can teach. So that's one thing I just wanted to start off with is to earn a PhD means you are deeply grounded in research. We're not going to talk today about something called an EDD or a doctorate of education, which is more of an applied opportunity, which I considered, and I think that can be a great opportunity for people too who really want to teach, maybe work at a university. So if you have questions about that, we can talk afterwards. But I wanted to first begin with kind of this reality of the PhD is going to train you to be a researcher, and it will unfold over many years, which is my second point, that there are some significant opportunity costs to spending 5 years or more as a graduate student. And you will, if you're a researcher out in the field, you will forego your wages in those years and earn much less as a doctoral student. And that's something to think about. And that's something that I thought a lot about prior to making this decision. And then the final thing I would say is earning a PhD, I would say, is much more about tenacity and perseverance and kind of having these burning questions about what you're curious about that are going to motivate you more than being a brilliant person. So I can't remember my GRE scores, but I was like right in the middle. I had a really hard time in my doctoral math classes. I failed my economics qualifying exam and had to retake it and was at jeopardy of not continuing in the program. I mean, I had some real big hurdles. And I would say my perseverance is what got me through, not necessarily any innate gifts when it comes to ability. So I want to affirm that too, that it's really a marathon to get through these many years of doctoral training. And it's generally worth it. I didn't grow up thinking I wanted a PhD. It was something that I thought about later in life. So I can't say like this is a dream realized. It's more like an idea that came to fruition that maybe is sometimes still a questionable choice, but generally speaking, I'm glad I did it. So I encourage you to think realistically about the costs and the trade-offs because it is an enormous commitment to make as an adult to commit 4 to 6 years to doctoral study. And so then that brings us to this application process. And I'm going to put it up here real quick. and walk through how the application process works. And then I'm going to invite Hunter to chime in across different steps and share his more recent experience with you. And so the takeaway here is this is very different than undergrad and MPA admissions. And that's maybe if there's one thing I leave you with today, it's that this is a sometimes counterintuitive process where as an undergrad, well, I won't get into all the details, but you know that applying to undergraduate institutions, the institution is looking for a broad, diverse population of people who are going to be successful at the institution. And it's a very narrow scope in terms of how PhD admissions work. So let me briefly talk about this and then we'll go through each step in greater detail here. So these steps are, it's important for you to identify your interests and think about what do you want to study? What do you want to commit 5 or more years to learning about? Then from that, you need to identify programs that are a precise fit with your interests. And not only programs, but potential faculty you would work with who are very closely related to your interests. And we can talk a bit about what that looks like. You need to actively research these programs and faculty to make sure that your initial impression is true, that there's a good fit here. You then submit applications, which are oftentimes quite long in terms of the essays that are asked for you, potential writing samples. You may have interviews. Hunter can speak to that, I know, in terms of the interview he had. And then you may have multiple offers to consider. And one of the best pieces of advice that I got is no one should ever pay for a PhD. And I know that sounds weird, but when you look at programs, if a program is going to ask you to commit 5 or more years of your life, in return, they should be able to fund you. They should be able to offer you RA or TA, so that stands for research assistantship or teaching assistantships, where they're essentially for your 20 hours a week of labor. In return, you're getting tuition and a stipend. So I'm deeply skeptical of, although it's not unheard of, but I'm worried when students get into PhD programs and then they don't have the financial support, because that just ends up being an enormous amount of debt for you. And we can talk more about that if you have questions. But this is, again, a kind of a tricky aspect of PhD programs is the offer of admission is one thing, but the offer of funding is another. And those go hand in hand and will concurrently really dictate what choices you have. And then finally, you make a decision. So let's jump in here and look at these processes. So let me run through this and then I'm going to ask Hunter to chime in and kind of share with you why he applied to certain programs and not others. But one of the things that's interesting that I often talk with MPA students about is just because you've earned your MPA in public administration or public policy, that does not mean you need to pursue a PhD in that. So Jose, for instance, could absolutely apply to an interdisciplinary environmental science program. Hunter applied to political science, which is, I would say, squarely disciplinary in terms of its norms. And we might think of these as like economics, sociology, kind of traditional departments. You may also be really passionate about a type of research. You may be interested in statistics or survey methodology, and you would then pursue a PhD with that focus. And then there are interdisciplinary doctoral programs, and I would consider the Evans School, our public policy PhD, interdisciplinary because we admit students who have undergraduate degrees and training in economics, sociology, environmental science. So you have lots of different ways to think about where you might apply. And I would say this is the first step. And a few of you mentioned this early on, is thinking about where in this kind of constellation of areas are you interested? And then what are your questions? What kinds of curiosities do you have about the world around us that would motivate you over the course of 5 or 6 years to continue to dig into these questions and collect data and analyze the data and make a contribution to the world's understanding of these questions? So it's thinking about discipline or methodology or the interdisciplinary scope of what you're interested in, and then subsequently, what are the questions that are within that area? So Hunter, why don't you take a minute and talk about, before you get into the programs that you applied to, maybe broadly, why you did some things and not other in terms of political science and other departments.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like applying to programs in the social sciences is a bit tricky, just because a lot of the methodologies and to a certain extent, some of the research questions are so interdisciplinary at this point. I took some classes in the political science department here last year and was talking to my professor about wanting to apply to PhDs in the fall and everything. And she told me, you know, don't really think about the distinction between like economics, political science, and public policy, because we're addressing a lot of the same questions in a lot of the same ways at this point. And that's certainly not true for every program. We'll get more into that in a little bit. But programs are very distinct. So it's hard to make sweeping statements. But yeah, in terms of how I came to figure out what I want to study, I started undergrad as an environmental science person, so double majoring in chemistry and biology, and took a full quarter of coursework on that and did fine, liked it, but wasn't passionate about it. And I came to find out over the next few quarters that I was really passionate about political science and social science in general, really. And then later figured out that you can actually have applications to environmental issues within those fields. So that's how I came to the environmental politics realm, which I guess I never said that. That's what I'm going to be studying in my PhD. And then, yeah, methodological training just comes with the coursework you take, figuring out what methods you enjoy doing, what you're good at doing, some things that you may not find as intriguing or useful for whatever questions you want to ask. And yeah, I think the one thing I'll say is you don't have to know specifically like what you're going to write your dissertation on to be able to apply to a PhD. I have no idea what my dissertation is going to be about beyond the field of comparative environmental politics. And I definitely thought that was something I needed to know going into applications. So if that was something that you were concerned about, I just want to assure you that that is not the case. You can go in with a general field in mind and be perfectly fine to succeed in that program.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
And Hunter, can you, well, let me go to the next slide. Why don't you tell us, where did you apply?
Yes, so I applied to 4 political science programs and 1 public policy program. The public policy program was the University of Chicago. And then the other 4 schools were UW, University of British Columbia, University of Toronto, and University of California, Santa Barbara.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
When I applied, I think I applied to 10 programs. 9 of them were PhDs in education policy or higher education. And then the single public policy program was the Evans School here. So in Hunter's process and my process and in most people's processes, after you decide what your questions are, what your areas are, then you start to identify programs and faculty that are a good fit. So you're looking at a given department and you're seeing if they have an emphasis in a given area. And then you see if one or more faculty are working in that area such that they would potentially supervise you for a number of years. And so with Hunter's work in environmental politics, he had done a targeted search. I was interested in college access policy when I applied. So I had a spreadsheet, which is part of my advice, of all the different programs around the country that I was interested in, and then spending lots of time online looking at faculty profiles, seeing which faculty are doing research in these areas. In my case, college access policy that I was interested in, or higher education policy. And this is a somewhat tedious process, but it's really important for you to determine that your interests are a good match with both a department and one or more faculty members there. So let me give you an example. I've talked to students who say, I'm going to apply to PhD programs and I'm applying to the top Ivy League public policy schools. the Kennedy School, I'm going to apply at USC, I'm going to apply at Stanford. And then as we talk, it becomes pretty apparent early on to me that the Kennedy School, for instance, is not a great fit for this student's relatively narrow focus. And so we're going to talk about that in the admissions process, but this is where it takes a lot of time. This is where I would say researching programs is like a part-time job in terms of identifying the programs, finding out who the faculty are. And then by actively research, I mean reaching out to people. And this is another laborious process, but you need to, I would argue, talk to people at these programs to again, understand if you're a good fit. This varies program to program. So in some places, like I reached out to the department at the University of Michigan, and I was directed to a doctoral student who fields all the questions. So this doctoral student in that department and I hopped on the phone and had a half-hour conversation, and it was super helpful for me to further discern if the program was a good fit for me. When I applied at the University of Pennsylvania, the University of Indiana University, Penn State, Vanderbilt, a few other places, I reached out to faculty and they replied back and we scheduled half-hour calls. And I had probably 30 or 40 phone calls with faculty just asking questions about the program and trying to kind of tease out, am I a good fit? I'll explain why this is really important in a moment here. But I would encourage you to think about, if you apply to PhD programs, who's at least one or two individuals you can connect with. And it's really a two-way street. They're potentially learning a bit about you, but more importantly, you're further discerning if the department is a good place for you. There are many questions you might have that are nowhere on a website. For instance, what does funding look like for your doctoral student? That's typically not advertised, but that's something that a professor can share with you and say, oh, we guarantee funding for all of our students for 4 years. Or most of our students are funded through teaching assistantships. So those details you really need, and you won't get, I believe, anywhere else than talking to. And Hunter, you'll have to remind me, did you end up talking to anybody? I know we talked about this, but in your kind of research stage, I don't remember if you emailed or called folks.
Yeah, I talked to a few, mostly at UCSB, because that was my first choice. So I really prioritized that. But yeah, this is the one thing that I wish I had done a little bit more of through my process. And I'm not going to like criticize myself too much for not doing it, because it was last fall, a full-time student working on applications. So my time was fairly limited. But yeah, if you have the time, you absolutely need to do this. And I know one thing Grant mentioned to me when we were talking about this process is, if one of your faculty of interest happens to be on the admissions committee and your file comes up, they're going to be able to immediately associate that conversation with your file and add a lot more information to the rest of the, committee members that people who don't get in contact with them are not going to get. So it's definitely a nice added bonus.
And the flip side is, let's say you have a dream faculty member you want to work with and you get them on the phone and they say, oh, I'm actually moving from Vanderbilt to UCLA, which happened to me actually. And had I not known that, I would have written my whole Vanderbilt essay about working with this faculty member. So these conversations are super helpful. That was a short phone call, but then I said to this faculty member, oh, your colleague so-and-so, they're still going to be at Vanderbilt. And she said, oh yeah, you should reach out to them. So then my email to that person was actually really easy to write, because I said, I had a recent phone call with so-and-so and she encouraged me to reach out to you. So again, it takes a lot of time, but it can go both ways in terms of helping you, but also then preventing kind of an erroneous presentation of who you want to work with. So then you submit your applications. You want to track deadlines. You want to be really aware of when things are due. You have to send transcripts, letters of recommendation. And let me just say, what's going on behind the scenes is when a department gets their applications, they're going to do a preliminary screen to make sure the person essentially has the skills to succeed in the program. But then the single most important process that is happening behind, I don't know, smoke and mirrors, whatever the metaphor is the faculty circulate a list of applicants and are asked asked to indicate who they could work with or who's a good fit for their research. So there's a couple things. The faculty in a department are going to get the question, does this student match with your research interests? And then does this, or do you have the capacity to supervise this student? Or do you have funding for this student? And in some departments, like at the University of Pennsylvania, where I applied, at Penn, each faculty member gets to take a couple students every couple of years. So what that means is after, say in this admission cycle, the faculty member gets to bring on 2 students to work with them. It might be a couple more years before that faculty member gets another couple students to work with them. Does that make sense? So even if you're a perfect fit for working with Professor Smith, if it's not Professor Smith's year to take a doctoral student, you won't get admitted. And likewise, some departments require that you have funding when you take a student. So a faculty member may have just received a huge federal grant and they can take on 8 doctoral students. And that depends on the doctoral student saying, I want to work with this faculty member and I also want to research this topic. So that's where by casting this net and by having these conversations, you know who's got funding potentially, who's taking students, who's not. And so that's what's happening behind the scenes. And that's one of the big takeaways I just want to leave you with is you might be the most perfectly qualified, brilliant applicant, but if your interests don't align with the faculty members and that faculty member doesn't have capacity to take you on as an advisee, then it's not going to be a match and you won't get admitted. So very different than undergrad and very important for you to then do the research and kind of understand what these moving pieces are behind the scenes so that you can potentially cast a wide net and apply to many different programs to maximize the odds of a good match. And then finally, you hopefully get 1 or more admission offers. And like I noted, you think about potential funding and what universities have offered you, and then you plug your nose and jump into the cold water and go for it and pursue this PhD. So again, a different process than undergrad and grad admissions, but with these final few minutes, I'd love to just see if people have questions or if there's anything we didn't talk about that you're interested in hearing more about. Why don't we open it up? Please, Evan, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm approaching this as a second career. I was an attorney for about 10 years before I started the MPA program. And so I'm a little bit further on in years than some of my cohort. And I'm wondering how, if at all, that should change the calculus for me.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's really up to you in terms of, are you able and willing to potentially dedicate 4 or 5 years to a program? Asking faculty how long it takes people to move through the program is really important. So that might be part of your calculus. So some programs say like, we can get you out in 4 years if you're super focused. Other programs will say like, we're more of a 5 or 6 year program. So I think you could think through how that might work given different factors in your life. Some PhD programs will waive some coursework too, if you've done prior graduate coursework. So like the Evans School does not do that, but the College of Education does here at the UW. So that's again a department specific policy, but that might be something that you research on your own. I think programs are really looking for people that are a great fit, and independent of your age or your professional background or years out of school or whatnot. I think it's really a matter of like, do your passions and do your interests align? And especially with legal training, like if you're interested in policy or something like that, I think could be really enticing to some faculty to think like, oh, we would love to have this person in our department and train him and get him involved in some projects. So The other thing I would say too, just to Evan's point, is it never hurts. I mean, this is a shit ton of work to apply to programs, but you can always say no. You can always trust your gut and decide at the end of the day, I'm not going to do this. And that's fine. Like that sometimes I think can be really empowering to know you could have, but it's not right. And so I would say that too, like up until, you know, you get your offers and then you discern where you got in, like you can always pull back and decide like, I'm going to work for a couple of years, or I'm going to, so that's another thing to keep in mind too.
Thank you. I actually have a follow-up if that's okay.
Sure.
I'm toying with the idea of extending my program at Evans to give me some time to take some math coursework. Is taking longer at the master's level something that would be frowned upon, or given my situation, is that just no big deal?
I personally don't think it's a big deal. We didn't really talk about it, but if you've taken quantitative coursework or math coursework or research design courses, and you're able to speak to those in your application materials, I think that's a real asset because it further demonstrates you kind of have a sense of what you're in for. So I don't think length of degree anybody would care about. And if anything, one of the things that you can think about is when you apply and you have faculty writing your letters of recommendation, I would encourage you to be explicit with what you want your faculty members to include, if anything, about, say, special circumstances. So, like, I got a lot of details from Hunter about his background with research and what he aspired to do with his PhD. But Evan, in your case, you might say to one of your recommenders, like, would you please explain why I took 3 years? Because I wanted more training and coursework to be competitive for PhD applications. And then your faculty member can incorporate that in their letter, and that should come across really smooth.
I'll also add that that's probably a question you would get in an interview if you don't address it in your application.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. What other questions or mysteries can we dispel or can we talk about here? Well, the final suggestion I'll make is my process is relatively stale. I applied to PhD programs a dozen years ago, but we have a wealth of knowledge in our current PhD students here at the Evans School. And I suspect next year, if we host a workshop like this and we don't have someone like Hunter, I'll invite a couple first-year students to talk about their process in terms of how they ended up here. But if you've connected with one or more PhD students here during their time as a TA in one of your classes, you should absolutely reach out to them and say, could I have 15 minutes to hear about how you went through this process? I mean, every single person's process is harrowing to some degree, stressful, exciting. I mean, they ended up here. So people are typically willing to share with you. And I think that can be a really great way to get gems out of why did they choose a PhD? What programs did they apply to? How did they go about getting letters of recommendation? Like that experience is super relevant. And I know our students are always generous with their time and would be happy to talk with you and mentor you if you decide to move forward. So that's my final bit of advice is, you know, you can look around on websites and you can think about like tips and tricks, but really connecting with people who have gone through the process in the past year or two is super valuable to kind of further discern, is this right for me? And if so, how do I go about the process?